All right, good afternoon, TC 108, Social Entrepreneurship, Innovating with Institutions. Welcome. This is our second guest expert of the day. I want to welcome everyone who's here. Hugo in Mexico, Mary, who's woken up at 4 a.m. in China just to hear us be with us today. Mary, awesome to have you. Karthik, who's in the DC area, Shauna, who's in Milwaukee, Sid in Boston. Welcome everyone else who's here. Really excited to have David Bray with us. David Bray is the Chief Information Officer of the Federal Communications Commission. He has 16-plus years of leading innovation and transformation collaboratives, fast-paced data, science ventures, entrepreneurs, intrapreneurs. So he's going to be sharing us with about the challenges of entrepreneurship in the government. If you can hear us, please, if you could, let us know. Questions in the box. David, there in the studio, maybe you could turn off the volume there so that we don't have that going on. But I'm going to jump in on the first question for you, David. Okay. So can maybe you share with us what are some of the most pressing problems you're attempting to solve today in the FCC, and how have you come to understand some of them?
Sure. I think the most interesting challenges we face at the FCC is the FCC has been around since 1934, and so it's the challenge of taking an organization that has a long and then very robust history and has had a lot of successes in its area, and also deal with the fast pace of change that we have going on in terms of technology. I think we all have personally experienced how quickly the internet adoption has occurred since the mid-1990s. We also now have the accelerating pace of apps and Wi-Fi and mobile devices. And so recognizing that in general, government systems were not designed to change quickly, and in fact that was intentional, particularly here in the United States, where you have to remember our history was we were born from a revolution, and so we were worried about the rise of a king-like individual, someone having too much power. And so we actually wanted sort of checks and balances to slow things down, but as a result, the trade-off is when we have these rapid paces of change that's going on with technology, trying to help both the organization, the FCC, but then also our partners move forward with speed. That's the most interesting challenge I think I face as a CIO.
What I've heard you say is, I think something that's very unique to intrapreneurship versus entrepreneurship is that as an entrepreneur, there's the speed, there's all this change happening, and you can be very adaptable. You can be very agile, you can kind of move with it. But as an intrapreneur, one of the things that you face is an organization, a bureaucracy, a system that is maybe not able to move along with that speed. So with all these technologies and all these opportunities that you're seeing inside the FCC, you're not really able to grab onto them. So can you maybe go into a little bit more about how you try to bring your organization inside as you try to deal with this problem back up to speed? What are some tactics, some techniques that you're looking to use to maybe, empower your staff, empower the partners that you're working with to be more agile inside this large company?
Right. So I think the essence there is to recognize where innovation really happens, and I think innovation happens at the edge, the interface of those individuals that are most focused on the problem. And so what I've been trying to do is use the model of entrepreneurships to actually have empowered within the FCC individuals that can work with the different programs we have in the different bureaus and offices, whether they be consumer-facing, whether they be more in the public safety realm, maybe they're more with wireless and regulation realm. Work with them and actually understand first sort of what are the challenges they're facing. And then can we storyboard them? Can we produce a very simple drawing of what's the challenge they're trying to face, or what's the workflow that they want to have, regardless of the IT solution? And then have that entrepreneur be empowered to work with them to actually try and figure out solutions that use IT. It may be in-house IT, it may be actually going to the outside and talking with industry and actually showing that diagram of that storyboard and saying, this is what we're looking for, we want to do this and this and this, is there any solution that allows us to do all three of those things, and if so, how would we implement it and how fast? But the idea that the CIO does not have to lead from top down, that instead the CIO can be more of empowering and sort of facilitating entrepreneurs within the organization. And I often say that my job is to be sort of that digital diplomat in that flak jacket so that they can innovate within that space. Now I do have to emphasize to entrepreneurs that it's not just about having a good idea, it's also about having that plan, how are you going to bring on both those people that are early adopters, but then also address those people that might be more hesitant to change? How are you going to lay their concerns and think about that holistically, about how do you do the overall strategy from start to finish of whatever initiative you're trying to do.
Interesting. So, okay, so I want to pull out two of the things that you said there, and I think the first one that I actually want you to expand on a little bit is that storyboarding one, that telling a good story. It's something in the morning we were with the executive partner of the Shoka Changemakers, and he said that when he sits at the table and he's got a lot of people there, a lot of them have good ideas. And some of them also have evidence. That's probably the second step. He says, you have a good idea, that's your first step. You have evidence, okay, I'm listening. But the way that you're going to attract resources and attract donors and get everyone on board is through that story.
Yes.
So maybe you have an example of a way that you're able to storyboard that. What's the process maybe internally as you're working on it? And then how do you present that? And what setting is it best to maybe show that final storyboard and start to kind of move that process forward?
Oh, I think that's great. So actually, an example you can actually find right now, if you go to Google and you search for FCC and you try to look at my blog, you'll find the most recent blog post from a few weeks back. Literally within the first week of my arrival at the FCC, I had one of the bureaus come forward, and they were looking for some new technology. And to be honest, they were jumping straight to the technology solution. And I said, well, why do you need this? And then they had some ideas as to why, but I said, well, I want to be fully supportive of the fact that you want to be early adopters. That's great, but could I have some of my people on my team work with you in the bureau to actually storyboard this so that we could actually understand the narrative of how you want to use it? Because I agree with you that the nice thing about storyboarding is if you can draw out very simply what you want to do, that means you actually understand it. It is actually a way of clarifying where there may be any ambiguity. It's trying to reach consensus, and it's actually fun to do. And so it's a good way of planning but not over-planning, because any plan will change and adjust over time. And it's also a great way of building consensus amongst people because they're all involved with saying, yes, that does make sense, that's what we're trying to aim for, we agree to that story. And I'm a big believer in the power of narratives. I mean, often organizational change is the art of understanding all the different narratives present in an organization and then finding ways to actually build a consensual narrative that spans across them. And I think that's the goal of any good leader, is to be aware of that. And you're absolutely right, too, that bringing data helps. And so in this case, once they had actually created the narrative of what they wanted to do with with doing secure field mobility and how could we do communications in the field, but at the same time be ensured that they're secure, we also now are engaging industry to look for data, because I think data is allowing you to actually make those adjustments, test what might be true or maybe an assumption that needs to be revisited, and help inform what you need to do.
Okay, excellent. So I want to get some of that knowledge pulled out a little bit and share it. Again, what I think I've heard from you here with the rest of the students. And again, if you guys have questions, put them in the box. We're going to get to as many as we can. So first, I guess something that you mentioned in the beginning that I think is key is transparency. Is that as your organization, not only did you say we're going to storyboard this, but we're going to share it. So it wasn't like you have to go in through a few different steps to get to this. You said go on Google and check it out. So I think that as someone who's leading intrapreneurship, that kind of transparency is really, really valuable. Second thing is that you had a willing party. One of the characteristics of intrapreneurs we talked about this morning is discipline. Discipline for that when you go into the field and you have a really great idea, you don't let it go too soon. You really hold back. You really gain as much knowledge from the community as you can until you start to develop your solution. And another kind of discipline you've talked about is you've had people come to you and say, we want an innovation. We're a willing party. Let's run, and we have a solution. We feel like we already have a solution. And you said you were able to say, hold on, to have that discipline. And I think that to kind of pivot them and not have them kind of get too down about it, you turn to this kind of storyboarding the idea, storyboarding the problem, and it's something that's fun. And I want to say that that's something that doesn't get brought out enough. I think in innovation is supposed to be a fun process, and if you're able to bring that kind of good humility and fun to it, more people are going to be rallying around it, and the change will a little bit easier. So I think that's a tactic that as we start talking about how to advance our innovation side of our institutions, the idea if you can make that problem framing process fun, you're probably going to build a lot of consensus. The other one that I think I'd like you to maybe put a little bit more on, because I think you have some particular insight, is on that data and evidence. Again, we talked about this morning was that the people that have a good idea, people that get to try it, testing out that good idea, is the ones who come with evidence. So maybe you can talk a little bit more about your evidence building process at the FCC. And at one point, do you find we have enough evidence to try to validate this and see how, if we can be scalable and start kind of maybe putting it out on Google for some public consumption? So again, your evidence building process, and what kind of maybe unique ways are you doing that?
Right. So first, completely agree with you. If you're not having fun when you're innovating, you're probably doing it wrong. And so the art is again, how do you make it so it's an enjoyable activity that people are sort of pulled and will actually want to actually help out with it. The one thing I tell my team is that we need to distinguish the difference between leadership and management. Leadership comes from the Greek word leet, which is actually to send unto death. And that's because in ancient Greece, the leets were the ones that would actually carry the flag in front of the army that would show where do you go. But of course, in a melee conflict, when one army meets another army, the first two that were going to die were going to be the flag bearers from the opposing armies. And so leadership is stepping outside of the expectations of other people. And you can't always do that. If you're always stepping outside of expectations, you'll quickly flame out because you're never getting any of your expectations done. At the same time, if you're always just doing what's expected of you, there may be times when the organization needs to go somewhere, but it hasn't reached the consensus that it needs to do that yet. And so your art of an entrepreneur is knowing when do you need to be in management mode, and when do you want to go into that leadership role, which means you then need to have that strategy for how you're going to manage that friction. And one of the ways you manage that friction is you do make it a fun activity, or you make it a humorous activity, or you make it something where even though it's going to create friction, there's a way of dealing with that friction. And often what I try to do is encourage that is data. I think data is a way that you can actually sort of say, well, I hear you're saying this way, I hear this other party saying this way, I hear this other party saying this way. You all have equal access. Bring your data, and let's see if we can understand what we're each trying to say, and maybe along the way we'll find out that some things we thought were true maybe needed to be adjusted, or we'll find new surprises that we all share. And so when do you reach that decision? Well, I guess that is the art of being a leader, is when do you have enough that you're willing to trust your intuition. That only comes from being willing to actually make a few mistakes and learn from them. I'd rather have someone that came to me and said, during my career, I took some risks, some of them didn't work out, and here's why. I think knowing why things didn't work out, than having someone that came to me and said, I had my career, nothing ever went wrong, but I also never really took any serious risk, because I think it's by learning and actually experimenting, and whatever you plan, make sure there's a strategy to recover from it if it doesn't work out, but be willing to take those risks, because it's good to have data, but at the end of the day, it's also about, just sort of seeing what you can do with people, because 80% people, 20% technology. And so knowing when you're going to be a leader, when you're going to be a manager, and having that strategy is key. And having someone that's willing to help allow you to take those risks and learn from those risks, I think is also key. I tell my team that I really want to empower them, as long as they communicate to everyone what they're doing, as long as they have a plan in the form of a storyboard and there's been sufficient discussion about what we want to do, they have my full backing, and if it doesn't work out, then we'll talk about why it didn't work out, but that's we pick ourselves up and we move forward, and that's my job to sort of be that flak jacket. And I think that's the art of how you create a culture of innovation.
I think that's great, and I think that last piece that you've echoed there is something that we've talked about a lot about the course, and we were learning a lot about, which are called godparents of innovation. Are those inside the institutions, sometimes more important than the innovator themselves, is that person with the institutional knowledge and the institutional clout that allows you to give you space to give to take those risks. So that godparent concept is something we can share with you more about, but we've echoed as a junior professional, as someone who's early out, finding those godparents. The other thing that you've hit on is to bring your evidence to the table. I can tell you from experiments, I can tell everyone out there that from experience, I've gone into a session with the senior management, given them an idea, and they said no. I went back, collected evidence from my stakeholders, came back to the same group, same thing, same idea, and they loved it. And they said, let's try it, because I brought the evidence. So I think evidence building, it can't be overemphasized how important that is, and I'm glad that you've talked a little bit about how you're doing at the FCC. So we have our first question from one of the students, Karthik, who is a student at Johns Hopkins University, and he wants to know how you're balancing the kind of complete decentralization versus centralized decision-making. So really, to have a streamlined thing, you need to have an integrated platform without too many applications, and yet we want to create an innovative culture that decentralizes and allows some people to feedback best practices. So our first question to you from one of our students is, how do you balance this complete decentralization versus the need for a centralized, machine that can run smoothly?
That's a great question. I think the opportunity that we now have with application protocol interfaces, or APIs, if we're consistent in how we do APIs across different systems, we can allow for that decentralized approach. And so my goal is not to over-specify everything in the enterprise, because quite frankly, one, I don't have the bandwidth to do it, and two, I'd probably be wrong, because again, I'm not at that edge of what's needed by the different bureaus and offices. But instead, if I can lead and help us reach consensus as to what's the sort of platform with the application protocol interfaces we want to have built on top of it, that allows for diversity in the organization. At the same time, there's interconnectivity across those different systems. And so that's allowing for sort of both a combination of centralized and decentralized approach. Part of it is also with my team. We have, with our entrepreneurs, they are actually assigned to different bureaus and offices, and their goal are to be interacting much more with the bureaus and offices and sort of being that interface on a daily basis that can sort of do the rounds, hear how things are going, be involved in the narrative, be involved in the decision making, and actually be empowered to understand their own unique sort of culture that they've inherited with whatever bureau and office they're working with, and then be able to then connect that back to the other parts of IT, but not have it be sort of traditional top-down, this is the plan, this is what we're going to do, and it's me making decisions, because quite frankly I'd be wrong. The other thing that I tell both the bureaus and offices, the programmatic people, and I also tell my own IT team is, I'm only human. There are things that I'm great at, but there are other things that I'm going to have blind spots to, particularly since I just arrived at the FCC. I've only been there for about 6 months now, whereas the average person's been there for about 15.5 years. And so I'll be the new person for quite a while. And so I readily come out and say, I know I'm going to have blind spots, I know I'm going to have things I'm going to miss, but I truly appreciate it when people come to my office, or they swing by, or they send me a note. There's even an anonymous opinions box where they can point out those things and bring data, again, to underscore your data point. It's okay to disagree with me, just provide the data as to why, and you might actually change my mind. And I am open to doing that, because I know that while there are things I'm good at, there are other things that I'm still learning and listening myself. And so I think that helps sort of diffuse some of the tension, because I think if you try to centralize everything, you really will pull all the energy out of the system. There needs to be opportunity for decentralization. At the same time, if you don't have consistency across the different decentralized efforts, so at least they can connect, then you really do sort of begin to evolve into entropy. And so it's that interesting balance you have to do between the two of them.
That's really interesting. And what I would say is I kind of call that, it's not really an either-or question, it's an and-with.
Yes.
And I think that actually ties right back into your kind of leadership versus management. You want to allow for leadership. There needs to be some decentralization there where people can lead their own ideas and try things out, but there needs to be management, right? The system has to still run. It still has to go. So it's all about that art of how do we balance leadership and management. And again, I'm going to come back to it again, because I think from at least, from hearing some of these things, that how important the transparency that you've put out there is, and kind of that I don't have all the answers here. We're going to make mistakes. Something that I think entrepreneurs need to have is to be able to fail better, I call it. Is
yes.
to say, okay, we're going to make mistakes, but we're going to be open and honest and ready to move forward with it. And that kind of leads me to my next question for you. So it seems like you guys are able to kind of bubble up, get some great ideas, have a deep understanding of here's a problem the FCC is facing. How do you communicate it now internally and externally? The federal government, I think, is probably one of the more bureaucratic organizations out there. So once you have an understanding of that problem and maybe have some ideas, you've storyboarded it, how do you go about starting communicating that to the different stakeholders internally, first, inside the government that you're going to need, and then is there any external partners that you also bring into that kind of momentum building process?
Yeah, that's an outstanding question, and it's one that we're actually right now that I guess I'm sort of at the 6 months in, so I can no longer claim to be a complete newbie at the FCC, is what we're adjusting is I think we need to have both outside and inside engagement and actually do them in parallel. We shouldn't do it in series. I think because oftentimes the outside engagement may actually inform what we need to do on the inside, and equally the inside may also inform the outside. So, for example, our website, it is my highest hopes, because our website, there's some work that we could do on there to make it even better, engaging the outside. One of the things that you've already seen that's happened is the chairman has done an effort to actually crowdsource opinions from both inside the FCC, but there was actually a blog post that was done back in November and December where we were actually seeking inputs as to what the FCC could do better as a whole, of which the website was part of it, but also how could we improve our processes. From that, there will probably be identified some focus groups that will hopefully be on the way that would involve input from the outside. Now we have to be recognizing that we want to make sure that that's universal, that's broad input. We don't want to have it be just any one group. But my goal is that will help us understand some of the things that we may be missing because we're so focused on certain things on the inside. But equally, having the same sort of outreach across the organization. One of the things I actually literally just did this morning was I sent a note to the team saying, if we're always going to the same players on our own team to get things done and not involving other members of the team, then we're not really embracing a whole team concept. And I really do want it to be the whole team concept. And so there may be times when we should step back and instead of going to the same player that we usually have certain things done for, if there's somebody that actually has an interest in that area and is willing to run with it, but has not traditionally been seen as the go-to person in that space, let's let them. And again, it's that idea of, again, let's be transparent. Let's say this is sort of a test. Let's see how it goes. But I, as a CIO, actually want to see what you can do. And so just sort of, again, creating that place where it's okay to have things not always go right. That's fine. Let's make sure that we have a managed risk so it's not a catastrophic failure, but it's sort of we plan for if this doesn't work out, we can make adjustments along the way. Part of that is also having transparency of what's the critical path. Two of the things that I really want to see happen at the FCC in the next year, ideally, that will help make happen is being transparent about what we're spending money on internally, so we can keep account of what's being done across the different bureaus and offices, and also being transparent about the status of our different efforts. And that would include the critical path, what are the milestones, so let us know if we're on target or off target if we need to make adjustments. But having that be seen not in spreadsheet form, but actually be something you can go to on our intranet and see across it. And where appropriate, there may actually be some instances where we can also say how things are going on external things. I mean, I'm already trying to practice that with the blog we're doing, where we're actually saying, here's one of our storyboards we produce. We're actually open to input. I've gotten some comments on the blog already. I've gotten some comments through Twitter that we're incorporating, and we're also going out to industry consortiums to see what industry can say, and then that's a chance for people to provide feedback. But really trying to make both myself and encourage the team to be open from input from all directions, inside, outside, other government peer agencies even. There may be great models. I think that's how, one, you can have this cross-pollination of ideas and improve your ideas, but you can also can begin to build a support base that says that idea that you're supporting that does make sense, and I've looked at it, I've provided my 2 cents, and it's been incorporated, and actually you can create a network effect of people that are actually promoting and encouraging the change that you're trying to bring.
Interesting. So I want to try to pull out some of these things because I think they're really good. First of all, is that kind of when you have the understanding, you're starting to communicate, you actually allow for a participatory process in that communication. What I like to say is that you're pulling from the internal and external, but you're also pushing it out for feedback. So I think that's a really interesting feedback loop that you're creating there through pulling both internally, externally, and also, again, the transparency coming back to it again. Also, way that you're able to start communicating what's the problem, get people thinking about it, is a kind of pushing different people on your team internally to think a little bit differently. One thing I want to share with everyone is that recently when I was at the MIT Media Lab, they were talking about something called the anti-disciplinary approach, which is sometimes what they do is they'll bring people around for a project, they have the problem statement, they're trying to get to an understanding of it, and they'll say, engineer, today you're going to write the business plan. And the person who's from the business said, today you're going to get your hands dirty and actually build it. And by putting people outside their comfort zone and making them tackle the problem from something, they're not exactly always used to, it allows them to maybe communicate it and understand it a little bit better. Coming to something we talked about this morning, which is empathy. Empathy is something super important that you're going to have to communicate that empathy both internally, hey guys, here's how we're going to have to change. It's going to be hard, there's going to be mistakes, but we're okay with that. But also on the outside, letting them know we're not perfect, but we're here to get your feedback and bring it in. So I think these are all critical things that you've brought up about what social entrepreneurs need to understand to start pushing these forwards inside their organizations. One of the terms that you brought up there that I kind of want to probe you on a little bit is this idea of the critical path. I'm wondering if you could maybe talk a little bit more what you mean about a critical path and maybe explore that term. I'm intrigued by it, so maybe you can share with the students as well what that is.
Sure. So at FCC, we're a big supporter of Agile, and so Agile, as folks know, allow you to change requirements as you're doing your different sprints. And what I'd like to do is at least identify as we move along where at least we should be making progress to keep our different stakeholders satisfied. Because at the end of the day, I've got to be aware that we've got the public that's counting us on some things, we've got Congress that's counting us on some things, the president's counting us on some things, the chairman, most particular, of the FCC, and so while it may not be necessarily defining exactly what we do from the start, because it may be as we do things and we learn from things we're going to make adjustments, and at least saying, okay, we're aiming for in 60 days we've got something that allows us to do the following. It's not all the way there yet, but it's there. In 120 days, we're a little bit more further along, and maybe 180 days, it's fully out. And so those are the milestones that we should be achieving, even though I've not tried to over-specify exactly what it looks like in 30 days, 60 days, 90 days, or 120 days. And so that way, then I can come back to the team and say, how are we on the progress 30 days in? Do you think we're moving along at the clip that we need to? Are we hitting challenges at moving at the speed? And if so, can you tell me why? Is it that we don't have enough resources? Is it that we need to get additional people focused on this? Have other things superseded it? But have it be a conversation about, we do want to allow for creativity and we do want to allow for serendipity to occur along the way. At the same time, we need to be conscious of, just like an entrepreneur needs to be conscious of the expectations of their backers and their venture capital firms. In the inside, we need to be aware of what's our equivalent of the inside venture capitalist firms that have placed, whether it be actual, in this case, public service, taxpayers' dollars in us, or have placed expectations and given us political support that we actually need to now deliver on that promise so that our chairman does have things that are successful and the FCC moves forward. And so being aware of that critical path, that's my way of saying, what are the different milestones we need to be reaching ideally by what date?
So I think this ties right back in for me in terms of the entrepreneur needing to be able to lead and to manage, because by creating this critical path, you're saying this is where we need to go. Here's our vision. Here's where we lead things to be. But you have a clear vision of those achievements. You're able to lead them. But then you have a process which you're able to manage, and it's actually an agile process. When I was meeting recently with the Chief Operating Officer of Global Giving, who has a very innovative team, and I said, how are you doing it? And she said, it's all about understanding this capacity for disequilibrium. Is that there are certain times and moments when it's okay to create a little bit of disequilibrium and make things, to be innovative, to be creative, right before, if you're an accountant, right before tax season, that capacity for disequilibrium shrinks very, very small. You shouldn't be trying out new things and introducing during that time, but that if you are able to set up the space saying over the next 60 days, this is our critical path, this is where we need to be to know if we're going to move forward, but I think what it sounds like, in one of the most difficult places for this innovation to happen, you create a space by allowing for that disequilibrium to happen, but also it being managed, which we've talked about. So yes. I find that to be really, really interesting. And now, is this something that, how did you learn about this? Was this something that you discovered, working inside of government or working externally? Where did the inspiration for that come from?
Right. So I guess I was lucky enough to start working for government when I was 15. So I've actually been with government for about 20 years. It included some time that I stepped away in the late 90s to spend time both with Microsoft and Yahoo, and then came back to government. And along the way, seeing a lot of well-meaning folks, and a lot of, people come into public service because a lot of them really, 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 really care. And I guess it was what really hit me back in 2000 when I signed up for the bioterrorism program, and then of course the world changed. We had 9/11 happen, and we had other events happen, that I saw time and time again extremely well-meaning, dedicated people that were working very long hours, and were, as my wife says, they're not fat cats, they're very skinny cats, much like, lean startup in government, because at a certain point, your hours, it's just nice, but that's just your contribution. You're not going to get any overtime or anything like that. People meant well, but the very system was actually discouraging horizontal collaborations, that the system was actually designed to actually have people stay in what we might lament and say are their silos. And so I actually went and actually got a PhD. It was actually in a business school focused on how to actually improve government responses to disruptive events, because my premise was that our world is accelerating the pace of disruption, whether it be human-created disruption or natural disruption or just general social society disruption, and that government was not designed to deal with disruption well. I mean, the whole point of having DC was back in the 1700s and the early 1800s. It took about 2 or 3 days by horseback to have communications between New York and DC. That's no longer the case. Now with mobile internet, we can involve people all across the country. I mean, you and I are having this conversation with people around the world, and that is transformative. And yet, our very institutions were not designed to do that sort of horizontal network collaboration well, because we were worried about a king. And so, after getting the PhD, I came back to government service and continued to serve, and began little mini experiments based on what I learned in the business school concepts to actually bring to government. And along the way, created a toolkit that I continue to grow and learn from. And that's where I tell people I like it when people point out other things I might be missing, because that may actually be a tool that I could add to the toolkit that seemed to have worked.
Interesting. So the first thing that I think that everyone needs to be aware of, what I like to call, it's the people that are doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. And it's actually one of the more difficult parts of the job, I think, as a social entrepreneur, because people want to join you and they say, well, I have something that's going to help. For example, giving away things for free.
Right.
That's something where it's very well-meaning, whereas people say, well, why do you want to go and try to sell them these treadle pumps that are going to be irrigating? Isn't it better if we just give them the treadle pumps? They live on $2 a day, and yet they, there was a story that my Ugandan friend said that every time you give it to them, they don't care. They 2 weeks later, they throw it up. But if they buy that thing, they're going to keep it shiny and new every day because it's a real investment. It shows the need. So again, I think what you've said there is something that people should be watching out for, are people doing the wrong thing for the right reasons. And I think that's one of the more delicate things that you have to figure out, because it's people that have good energy and want to be really supporting you. So something we can probably talk about later in our next module. The other one that you've talked about is, I think, goes to the case for social entrepreneurship, which is disruption. That oftentimes, yes, you're going to be disrupting, so maybe the best time for you to be looking for your opportunity to try out something new, to be innovative, is during a time of disruption. And with all this new technology entering, I think that really we do have a chance for that.
Yes, the time is perfect right now, and I think you hit the nail on the head that you should be acutely aware of the motivations and the incentives of people. In fact, I think the best social entrepreneur is one that's a good people watcher and has had that experience of seeing what motivates, because different things will motivate different people. And the art that you really are of being a social entrepreneur is what I call, and other people have called, creating a choice architecture. So, for example, a fairly mundane thing. I could have come out with a memo and said, network printers are more cost-effective than local printers. If we need to be saving money, we shouldn't be investing in local printers. We'll do network printers. But that would have been very top-down. Instead, what I can do is I can actually have the team produce what is the actual cost of a local printer versus what is the normalized cost of a network printer for 5 years, and then actually show that for bureaus, what are the costs per users for each user in a bureau, and actually show, well, in your bureau, your cost for users is this high, because you have this combination of local and network printers. In another bureau, they've used more network printers, they're lower than you. And actually, if I show that across the board for all 18 different bureaus and offices, that may actually then serve as a sort of motivational aspect for them to each want to try and make a decision without me coming out with a top-down memo saying we'll do more network printers versus local printers.
Interesting. And I want to hit one thing you said right in the beginning there, which I have also found to true, is that when you present your innovative idea, when you're looking for feedback, sometimes it's that one person in the back of the room who's very quiet and doesn't say a word. At the end, you should try to go up and engage them. I know I've done design reviews in rural Africa, and the loudest, the chief is the one that's only allowed to speak. But if you go on after and you talk to that farmer or you talk to someone else, you're really going to get some insight. So again, kind of get started thinking of really inclusive innovation. Something that I like to really highlight is that being inclusive is going to get you further and get you some good insights. So I have another question here I want to get to. It comes from Mina, who's an assistant professor of international communication. And she wants to know, what do you do to get creativity out of the unusual suspects? And I think that you probably have some good insights, having worked in government, what is not always known for its creativity. What are some of the best ways that you've been able to kind of pull creativity and achieve some success with that in your work?
Right. So I think the first step is asking them what brings them joy, which usually throws them for a loop. I've asked this question of a couple of people, and they look at me like, why are you asking? I said, well, what brings you joy at work? I mean, where do you find happiness? What gets you excited? And sometimes they don't have an answer right away, and you're like, that's fine, come back to me when you get a chance, I'd like to talk to you about it. And have them practice some introspection as to what brings them joy. And then say, okay, how might you see that bringing benefit to the organization as well? And then you have some ideas. And then collectively, after you've done that with individuals, maybe get them off site for a half day or something like that in a setting that's different than the setting they're used to. In fact, we recently did this at the FCC, and where I usually wear a suit and tie to work, I told everyone I said I was going to wear blue jeans that day, and it was actually going to be, let's see what we can do to think outside the box. And so changing the environment, but changing the environment only after you've actually sort of triggered some introspection on their part about what their passion is, what brings them joy. Because, again, I'd like to think that everybody means well. It's just a challenge of, are the right incentives in place for them to actually translate what they would like to do in their joys to what brings benefit to the organization. And so my job is, as sort of facilitator and diplomat of that, is to sort of arrange both the individual nudges as well as the environmental nudges to get them to think creatively.
I think that's an awesome answer, and it's this inside-outside dichotomy that you got, that the first step is to get them to know them internally, inside, what's going on with them, maybe even a little bit personally, so you understand who they are. And we know that for social entrepreneurs to be successful, it needs to be personally passion-driven. So I think that's a huge point. The other one that you said, I think, cannot be underestimated, but is getting people not just to think outside the box, but literally get outside of the box itself. And that by changing that environment, by bringing your team to a place that they're not used to, is sometimes enough to push it over the edge. I've seen it happen definitely before, that having people come to that same room where you have your daily briefings and asking them to think creatively, probably setting yourself up not for much success. So I really like that answer. Some practical tips. So Mina, thanks for that question. I have another question from Sid. Sid is a corporate responsibility fellow at PricewaterhouseCoopers. And Sid wants to know how you kind of manage the risk-reward. Because inside government, it seems like the risk-reward is way out of bounds. In corporate, you could see risk-reward could be huge, but here the risk is a lot of public scrutiny, a lot of people saying this is not what we're supposed to be doing, and the reward for the individual is not as high. So kind of how do you? And that's probably why risk-averse. You might see a lot of risk-averse people. So how do you view this risk-reward? How do you deal with it? Yeah, that's a great question, Sid.
So you're right. Government was not designed to encourage taking risk, but at the same time, we live in a world in which it now needs to. And so I'm actually, again, being that flak jacket. Hopefully I won't get too many bullets, but I'd love to come back in a few months and let you know how it's going. But you're right. And what I tell people is, while we'll never have an IPO in government, we will have a OPI, which I call an opportunity for positive impact. And I think there have been several studies that have shown that if you give people the ability to both be empowered in their jobs and give them a sense of challenge and give them something that's actually sort of a sense of worth, while you're not going to necessarily ever have the monetary, we're never going to have an IPO. We've had sequestration for the last 3 years. So salaries have been fairly flat. The monetary reimbursement's not going to be there. But there will be a sense, and I think what I would recommend to anyone engaging with public service is be very mindful that the person's coming here because they're passionate about it. There's a sense of self-worth about the mission. Make sure you continue with whatever change effort you're doing to allow them to continue to feel that and be very cognizant of that. But you're right, the risk reward's not there. The other two things I do is, one, I always tell the story of Admiral Nimitz. So Admiral Nimitz, when he was an ensign back in 1908, he ran his boat aground in the Philippines accidentally. He was new, didn't, for whatever reason, didn't read the maps exactly, ran his boat aground in the Philippines. He was court-martialed, but he wasn't drummed out of the Navy, and instead he was assigned to submarines. And then about 35 years later, he ended up being a 5-star admiral in the Pacific. And so I tell that story because I sort of say, well, imagine if that happened today, and someone in the Navy ran their boat aground. Well, probably one, it would all be over Twitter. It would probably also have maybe 3 or 4 days of news coverage, and it would not just be about trying to fire that person, but then firing that person's boss and that person's boss. And would we be out of a future five-star admiral as a result? And so being cognizant of telling the story that our world has changed, and some of the several great things that allow for transparency and communication also may lead to circumstances where we as a world are less tolerant of people that do take risk. I think at least allows for that reflection where people can understand that, at least I'm going to try underneath my watch where possible to be as extremely supportive of people to take risk, and it's measured risk. I mean, don't do anything that would completely bring down the FCC, please. But at the same time, let's think about those different gates that we can have that's measured, calculated risk. I think that's a doable way to go. But at the same time, there's going to be things. I know I may even, we're all going to be human. I'd rather have people that are willing to take challenges than those people that are never willing to take challenges at all.
So the first thing that I just heard from you that is important, so Sid, a great question, is that if you're in a really risk-averse environment, storytelling can, again, not just about framing the problem, but about framing the case for change. Storytelling is really important because, I mean, that story was a great way for us to understand, okay, this is the way it's been in the past. People have taken risks. This is the opportunity. We can't always pass it up. So I think storytelling, something that I'm seeing now, something new for me, is that storytelling is not just about framing the problem that you're trying to solve, but storytelling can be very key to trying to change the culture that you're working in. And I really, again, I want to put this one back out there, is that it's not, the government might not have an IPO, but it does have an OPI, opportunity for positive impact. And it's interesting, I think that positive impact that you were making me think about was not just about the external, which was obvious, but about the internal. It was about the government workers, having them more engaged, having them get more out of their job, and thus doing their job better. And that's something that the government should be striving for, and that's something that, again, calculated risks, managed risk. We want to lead change, but we're going to be managed. And I think that by building your reputation in that way, and by having stories, but also saying, this is my reputation, I want to lead change, but it's going to be managed, is a great way to kind of change that culture and create some room for social entrepreneurship to actually happen. So Sid and Mina, those were really great questions. So I'm going to go with, there's another question, so I want to get to this one. A little off base, but let's hit on it quickly. It comes from Karthik. And he wants to know now about internationally. What are some of these differences in social innovation with government, from your experience perhaps, that is happening in other countries? How is it maybe a little bit different than the U.S.? What are some of the different opportunities? And maybe what can we learn here? What have you learned from other countries about what they're doing with social innovation inside their governments?
Right. So I've had a lot of contacts with colleagues both in Canada and the UK. The UK government is interesting that whereas in the U.S. we have a government workforce, but we also have a very large contractor pool. And there's a lot of work is done by contractors that are for-profit. In the UK, it's almost the reverse. So there's a very large government workforce, but there's very little contractors. And so that's a slightly different dynamic. The other thing is other countries other than the US, there can be more opportunity for capital planning. In the US, generally you have to spend all your money by a certain time period. You can't carry it over to the next year. That creates interesting dynamics, whereas in other countries that may not be the case. And so there's not that same sort of artificial, you must spend your money by a certain date or it disappears. UK is doing a lot of great stuff with having sort of a consolidated, consumer-friendly, public-friendly portal for their web efforts, and they actually have some interesting efforts there. The challenge is because the U.S. government is so distributed, I'm not quite sure if it would fit our same model, but it's definitely, I look at what they're doing and I'm very impressed. Equally in Canada, I was meeting once, not in my current role, but in a past role with the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. And what's interesting there is, their police force is the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, whereas in the United States we have a very distributed, decentralized approach, and I think we were talking about how the U.S. has over 50,000 police jurisdictions, and they were saying they didn't really even have 50,000 Royal Canadian Mounted Police, and so it's just the difference in sort of, we're a very decentralized approach in the U.S., again owing to our heritage with the Revolution, whereas other countries may be able to collaborate more. I look at what Europe's doing, and you're beginning to see this, and then what Africa's doing with mobile, that it's about empowering the citizen to do things, and I think that's something we can bring back here in the United States, and I think that fits quite well with our narrative of we the people. If in the past we had checks and balances because we created silos between government, maybe in the future what we could do is, instead of having those checks and balances be fragmented silos in government, it could actually be empowering citizens through greater transparency about what we're doing, giving them the ability. We launched recently an FCC speed test app where if they choose to, they can view the code, it's open source. If they choose to download it onto either their iOS or Apple device, that actually allows them to actually see their broadband speed 3 times a day, and then anonymously share that with a third party that's shared with the FCC, which we then actually visualize and share with everyone back, and you can actually download the data if you want to analyze it yourself, which is an anonymized crowdsourced map of internet connection speeds across the country that was actually created by citizens. And so I think that's just interesting if we really want to look at where we're going maybe in terms of the representative democracy that US is maybe the future is really expanding the definition of public service, so it's no longer government and non-government. Maybe it's that public service is this umbrella that includes empowered individuals and citizens, it includes public-private partnerships and nonprofits, and it includes government. And that may be the interesting model that we need to actually encourage and move forward on together.
Great. So I want to pull out 2 of those things that you've mentioned there that I think are things that we've heard throughout our guest experts, is that external networks can be a great source for ideas. Again, we've talked about going outside the box for creative thinking as a team, but I also say that why it's so important to keep a network of professionals in all different industries and all different places is to have them, because you can pull some of your best ideas from them. I do think innovation happens at the cross-section of cultures. So I think that that's a really good thing that social entrepreneurs, we need to remember that it's not good enough just to keep our internal networks growing. We have to continue with our external networks. The other piece that you've talked about that I think is key to framing problems and getting momentum as social entrepreneurs is empowering. You've talked about empowering the citizen. I would call it for all, because we're all from different sectors in our class, empowering the stakeholder. If you are able to empower the stakeholder, your key beneficiary, your key customer, in framing the problem, then when you go to you have so much more evidence, momentum, and voice. You have like a voice of all the citizens who've now collected their broadband speeds. They have a small incentive. I want to see it myself, and in that I can be adding to this kind of huge database so that we can understand as the government, what is the real problem, what are speeds that people are actually facing. So something that as we move from our framing the problem to how do we advance, I think that this cannot be highlighted enough, is that if you're able to engage your stakeholder, your key stakeholder in building what that problem is, what it looks like, and what potential solutions can be, you're going to get a lot further, especially with your senior management, than if you just come at it by yourself. So I think that was a really great example. I'm going to be testing my speed out later, I think, after this session. So it's really great to learn about that. So I want to ask you another question, because, again, we've talked about this godparent idea of, the key ally for a young innovator inside a large organization is that godparent. It sounds like you're really open. You must have a lot of people coming to you with ideas. So can you give us maybe an insight to how do you analyze that idea? We know that there's going to be some looking at the evidence, but someone comes to your office, maybe they drop an anonymous note in, and they say, "Here's my idea." What process do you go through when you're deciding to take it to that validation stage? What kind of thought processes, and what do you look for in that junior professional beyond maybe the idea itself when you're deciding to go forward?
Right. So I do look for, first, do they have some data? And in my opinion, does it come from a fairly unbiased source, or is it biased? I also generally do not tend to just jump to the decision on my own, and so generally if an idea comes in or something like that, I will usually turn to about 2 or 3 people, and I may actually pick some people that I might know that might be initially resistant to the idea, and actually sort of use them as a sounding board and say, well, what do you think of this? If you have a chance, give me your thoughts. And that helps me, because then I get different reactions and viewpoints, and I can actually intentionally maybe pick someone that's maybe going to be a resistor to actually give their thoughts. The other thing I look for is I ask, and the number one question I say is why? Why do we want to do this? Because I think why is what motivates people. The how and the what. The how is secondary, the what is not so much, but if you can tell me why, that shows you understand the narrative and the thing to be addressed. And then I also ask the question of, well, who would resist this, and can you give me 3 reasons why? So that also shows they've done the art of, it's not just dealing with the specific issue at hand, they've actually thought about the broader system they're trying to produce this change in. They are aware of the potential detractors, and they actually have awareness of what their concerns might be. And then the follow-up question would be, if they could identify that, would be, what are the strategies to try and address those concerns. And so they've actually gone to the next level, which is not only have we identified that there may be some people that are all gung-ho about this idea, there may be detractors, and here's our strategy for addressing them. If they can answer all that, it's great to go. If they don't, then I will involve them in the process of actually walking them through that process, which means it may take a little bit longer, but I'll ask those questions of, why don't you come back later and tell me a little bit more about who do you think you're going to be your early adopters are, who's going to be the ones that are going to be a little bit more resistant, what's your strategy for them, what's your overall strategy for communicating the idea and moving forward. If it's a small investment, in fact, one of the things we're looking at the FCC to make sure we get legal approval to do is internally within government, trying to set aside a small amount of funds that people could pitch ideas for on a quarterly basis. And as long as they have a plan and they've identified milestones and they personally commit to saying, I can get this done in, say, 3 to 6 months, then I'm willing to take that risk. If it's a bigger amount, it's obviously going to require more of a peer review, a little more peer scrutiny, and then I'm going to listen to everyone's views and at the end of the day try and synthesize the ideas the best I can.
Okay, so you've hit a really important point that I've learned from experience, and thankfully you're a godparent that you might come to you and you might be no, but I'd say that often in other organizations, when you have to understand, when you go to the top, when you go to the person you think might be the one near the top who's going to greenlight your idea, that once you go to them and they say no, there's no more anywhere higher to go. Right. So I think one of the things that I would say that what you've told me is my advice for the entrepreneurs, the budding social entrepreneurs of our class, is not to go to that godparent or to your CEO right away. To really test that idea, do opposition research. And opposition research means going to people who you think might hate the idea and seeing what they have to say about it. Because once you go to the top, there's no going back. I mean, with you, it sounds like maybe they could get a second life, but in the corporate setting and other settings, I think that isn't really a reality for people. So I think having allies that are at the lower level, being able to test your idea, having a good internal network, so that when you go to that potential godparent, that CEO with your idea, you've had some kind of testing with it. A really, really key point. The other one is to think about what resources is it going to take to test this idea. Because maybe this is, again, about framing the problem and the solution that you have. Sometimes you might say, well, here's my end goal, here's where I want to lead it. But right now, what is the smallest piece of this that I can minimally test and bring that to the CEO or to the godparent? I think would be my advice for that. So, again, thank you for providing that, because again, this is something that everyone, I think, has echoed through our course. People want to learn about is how do I get recognized as an innovator? How do I get some room to test out my ideas? Okay, so I have another question from Monique. Monique is joining us from Paris. We have about 10 minutes left, so if you guys have questions, get them out there. Monique just joined, but she wants to know what is an example of one of the most innovative solutions that perhaps you've seen carried out inside the FCC or maybe the government, not your own, maybe another one, and how is it implemented? Right.
So I think I would probably, I'll give a shout out to my friend Matthew Burden and several folks at the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau that have, they were working on basically an open source solution for well, actually, there are two things I would give them. First, I would give them credit for how they approach complaint management. And it's actually one thing that I'd like to see the FCC do, and hopefully we can move in that direction, which is, so Consumer Financial Protection Bureau had the luxury of, they started about 3 or 4 years ago, and they had the challenge of how did they deal with consumer financial complaints. And they did an innovation which is both simple at the time and at the same time a little bit transformative, which was, by default, complaints would come in via the web, and if it didn't work via the web, then you can actually handle it by phone. And while that doesn't sound too transformative, you have to recognize, again, with the FCC being around since 1934, our complaints are still pretty much coming in by paper forms. And so by going default to the web first, that immediately gets it into electronic form, and then on top of it, they recognized that it was not actually an IT issue to manage this well, it was actually a non-IT in terms of the process. That if the process was something came in via the web, if it had to come in by phone and transcribe, it could do that. But then immediately turn around and actually pivot to who was ever being complained about, whether that be in the banking sector or something like that, and give them a time window to respond to it before the government gets involved. And so that's a more efficient use of our actual resources. I want to definitely give kudos and props to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to do that. The other thing that I would actually give credit to with them as well is they did an open source solution for their own regulatory filings. It's one of the things that I would love to actually consider at the FCC. The biggest challenge is actually there's just no demand signal, and so I think it's one of those things that they came up with this great solution that other people could use the code if there was a desire. The challenge, though, is oftentimes in government, I can encourage thoughts on the non-IT side as to what we do, but it really has to be something that they individually at the end of the day own. And if that demand signal is not there, then it's more of a question of, well, how much do I want to take it on, or how much do I want to try and work with them if they're not asking for something like that. But I think the two props I would give is both Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, which, again, relatively new government agency, 3 or 4 years old, going to a web-first approach for both receiving consumer complaints and also doing online sort of managing of the regulatory filings.
So I want to pull something out of that we've echoed in the morning, but I want to talk about it because it's so important, is the idea that there are two kinds of innovations for organizations. There are sustaining innovations and disruptive innovations. And oftentimes a lot of our attention, our thoughts means it has to be a revolutionary innovation. It has to be something that's going to disrupt the system. But sometimes it is these small sustaining innovations that are just changes of process that end up creating huge results. We just talked about resources again, that the sustaining innovation, especially early in your career, you're trying to build a track record that although at the top they might be calling for disruptive innovations, sometimes they're just talking about sustaining small innovations, evolutionary innovations, that over time will make a big difference. So I think that's really what I just pulled out of that example that you've given us, is that, yeah, that sounds really small, right? That sounds inane. Of course you should be going, but for them it was a big deal. It was a sustaining innovation that changed the way that they do business, changed the way that these problems were being addressed. So that's something that I would pull out of that. Again, as social entrepreneurs, it's okay to look for sustaining innovation, small things to process that might not look big today, but down the line might make a big difference.
Oh, in fact, what I would say is my role in public service is I love it when people pitches an idea that on the surface, you may say, well, that's not as shiny as some other ideas, but it has a whole lot of substance. I would much prefer to invest in ideas that have a whole lot of substance and do save time, save resources, free people up to do things that are more creative than things that may be shiny but may be ephemeral in nature.
Okay, so we have time for one more question. So I want to ask you a why question.
Sure.
And that why question is going to be why entrepreneurship? That's going to be my final question to you. Why do you believe entrepreneurship is something that's so important for the future of our government, for organizations, and how do you think it can change the way that we do business?
Sure. So why entrepreneurship? I think it's because, first I would answer it first by saying there's a wonderful poem by E.E. Cummings, and I'll paraphrase it a bit, but he says, "Oh humanity, how I love you. You are always forgetting that you have the secret of meaning of life in your back pocket and sitting down on top of it." And I think that is the nature of human institutions, is we do wonderful, great things, but when the world is an accelerating clip of change, as we are currently right now in terms of technology and in terms of societies, that's when you begin to see this sort of disconnect between what the institution was originally designed to do and what the world now needs it to do. And that sort of change can only happen from the inside. I had a great university professor once. I had come back from South Africa. I had been reporting on HIV/AIDS there, and I was a little bit disillusioned. And I wanted to spend another year overseas, and so I spent some time overseas. And he said, "Feel free to do that, but recognize you will always make more change as an insider than you will as an outsider." And at the time, I didn't understand that fully, but I think that is truly the case as to why entrepreneurs matter. Is you will always create more change as an insider than an outsider. You may not necessarily get as much recognition. Again, it may be more about change for substance that people don't recognize until after you've moved on. But if we as a world are going to do wonderful, beautiful things, that's going to take a network of entrepreneurs working across different institutions, being aware of their own unique institutional cultures, but then also working together across that network that spans us all to actually truly improve our world.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to end today. We're right at 4 o'clock. So, David, I want to thank you for your time. Again, like you said, across sectors, that's what we're doing here. And today you've added a really big piece of the puzzle here, which is public service. Where can entrepreneurship matter there? I want to thank everyone who joined us from Mexico, the UK, China, France, India, all over. Thank you guys for coming. David, again, thank you for your time. Our next guest expert will be on Monday. Professor David Grayson will be joining us, who is releasing a book on social entrepreneurism and all that jazz. That'll be at 12 o'clock Eastern time on Monday. So thanks, everyone, for joining us. Thank you, David, once again, for sharing a little bit of your insights and wisdom. And if you guys have further questions for David, please feel free to put them up on the message boards, and we'll send those over to you, David, so you can hear about the comments and questions that have come out of this viewing, because some of us will be watching it later on the recording. So everyone have a great afternoon, and thank you very much.
Thank you.